Elves in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth are some of the most captivating characters in his stories. These elegant beings, known for their magical powers and timeless grace, once played a huge role in the world of Middle-earth. But as time went on, many of them left for a mystical place called Valinor. Why did they choose to leave? Did they all go, or did some decide to stay behind? What happened to them after their departure? Are you curious to learn more about their adventure and the secrets of their final days? Well, to know all about this, you'll have to stay tuned till the end. In J.R.R. Tolkien's world, elves are among the earliest and most intriguing characters. They are different from humans and dwarves in that they live forever, though they can be killed in battle. When an elf dies, their spirit goes to a special place called the Halls of Mandos in Aman. After living a long time on Middle-earth, elves often feel a deep longing for a magical land known as Valinor, which they can reach by sailing from the Grey Havens. Elves play important roles in Tolkien's famous books, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Their background is richly detailed in the Silmarillion. Tolkien drew inspiration for these elves from ancient Northern European tales and languages, especially from Old English. These stories painted elves as tall, striking, and skilled in archery, living in untamed natural settings. Tolkien also created unique languages for them, such as Sindarin and Quenya, adding depth to their culture and history. Over time, Tolkien's vision of elves has become a popular and influential model in fantasy literature. They appear in many adaptations of his works, including films and role-playing games. If you enjoy stories filled with magical beings and epic adventures, understanding Tolkien's elves can offer a fascinating glimpse into the rich world he built. Icelandic folklore, particularly this collection, played a significant role in shaping Tolkien's elves. This collection from the 17th century and later describes elves as the first race, capable of marrying humans, but lacking an immortal soul. This framework helped form the basis of Tolkien's portrayal of elves, though he added his own unique twists. The English word elf comes from the Old English word elf, which is related to similar words in other Germanic languages. In ancient Germanic mythology, there are many different kinds of elves. Over time, the idea of elves in the West Germanic regions evolved separately from the Scandinavian concept, and even more so in Anglo-Saxon traditions, possibly influenced by Celtic myths. Tolkien was aware of these varying traditions. He even mentioned in a letter that his version of elves was different from those found in Scandinavian mythology. His elves were inspired by these ancient myths, but were crafted into something new and unique. One Middle English source that Tolkien might have read is the South English Legendary, written around 1250. This text describes elves in a way that resonates with Tolkien's own depiction. In Tolkien's world, some elves live in the undying lands of Valinor, a realm of gods and mystical beings, while others remain in Middle-earth. A notable character, Galadriel, was once in Valinor, but now resides in Middle-earth, showing a complex mix of characteristics. In the Middle English sources, elves were sometimes known as beings who could live both in this world and in an earthly paradise, and this raised questions about their nature, such as whether they had souls and what happened to them after death. Some scholars, like Tom Shippey, suggest that Tolkien resolved this mystery in the Silmarillion. According to this book, when elves die, they don't go to heaven. Instead, they go to the halls of Mandos in Valinor, a sort of halfway house between this world and the afterlife. By the late 19th century, the term fairy had evolved into a symbol of a magical, idealized world, and this concept was often used to comment on and critique social and religious values. Authors like J.R.R. Tolkien and T.H. White carried on this tradition in their writings. For example, Estella Canziani's painting, The Piper of Dreams, became popular during World War I, selling 250,000 copies and bringing a touch of fantasy to soldiers' lives. Illustrations of Robert Louis Stevenson's poem, Land of Nod, were also used to uplift and inspire troops. During this time, the idea of fairy was often associated with a nostalgic image of Old England, meant to evoke a sense of patriotism. When Tolkien began writing his first poems about elves in 1915, the words elf, fairy, and gnome had various and sometimes conflicting meanings. Tolkien was advised to avoid the term fairy because it was increasingly linked with certain social connotations, but he chose to use it despite this. Over time, Tolkien preferred the term elf over fairy. In his 1939 essay on fairy stories, he discussed how English words like elf had been influenced by French terms like fée and fairy, which also meant fairy. However, these words had also absorbed elements from German, Scandinavian, and Celtic tales, contributing to their rich and varied meanings. Tolkien's choice of words reflects a deep understanding of their historical and cultural evolution. While fairy had become a term used to reflect idealistic and sometimes political ideas, Tolkien used elf to draw from a broader range of traditional folklore. These stories often seemed contradictory, reflecting a variety of cultural beliefs. For example, in Old English literature, such as the epic poem Beowulf, elves were grouped with giants and demons, often seen as ominous and dangerous beings. This portrayal of elves as somewhat threatening or malevolent was common in early medieval texts. In Middle English stories, elves were also depicted in unusual ways. In the tale of Sir Gawain, elves are described as elvish men, which implies they were strange and uncanny creatures. Christian texts from Iceland show disapproval of the old customs of sacrificing to elves, indicating that elves were seen as both mysterious and potentially troublesome. Elves were even thought to be harmful in more practical ways. The term elf shot referred to unexplained injuries, believed to be caused by elves. This idea connected elves to old-fashioned remedies and fears, suggesting that elves could be behind some forms of illness or injury. For instance, water elf disease might have referred to dropsy, a condition involving fluid retention, and elf pain was thought to be a form of mental illness, perhaps similar to what we call lunacy today. Despite these negative connotations, there were also positive associations. In Iceland, someone might be described as fair as an elf woman, indicating exceptional beauty, and the Anglo-Saxons had terms like elf beautiful for someone very attractive. Tolkien blended these diverse traditions into his own unique version of elves. He drew on Old English descriptions of elves as forest and water spirits, such as wood elves and water elves, giving his elves a strong connection to nature. He also incorporated the idea that elves lived in a magical, otherworldly realm where time could be distorted, as seen in his depiction of Lothlórien. One significant influence on Tolkien's portrayal of elves came from the Middle English poem Sir Orfeo. This story adapts the classical myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, setting it in a wild, enchanted land where the elves live. Tolkien was inspired by the image of elves appearing and disappearing mysteriously, and their association with a magical, untamed wilderness. He used elements from this story, like the mysterious hunt of the elves and their proud but noble nature, to shape his own depiction of elves in his writings. His elves are both beautiful and dangerous, connected deeply with nature, and inhabit a world where magic and mystery are always present. Tolkien's skill in combining these old stories and ideas helped him create a consistent and compelling vision of elves, showing how ancient myths can be reinterpreted to fit new and imaginative contexts. In Tolkien's early poetry, which was written around the early 20th century, we can see traces of traditional Victorian elves and fairies. These early works were inspired by the lively and whimsical portrayals of elves in fairy tales and poems. For instance, Tolkien's poem Goblin Feet from 1915 features small magical creatures with tiny horns and padded feet, reflecting the playful and enchanting image of fairies that was popular at the time. Tolkien's encounter with J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan and his reading of Catholic mystic poet Francis Thompson also influenced his early ideas about elves. By the time he was working on the Book of Lost Tales, written between 1917 and 1927, Tolkien began to shape a more complex vision of elves. In this collection, elves are portrayed as once being a grand and powerful race. Over time, as humans grew in prominence, the elves gradually became less significant and diminished in both number and influence. This idea was inspired by Norse mythology, which speaks of a once great race of elves. Tolkien's elves were similar to the Norse Ljósálfur, a type of light elf, and reflected medieval stories like the Welsh Mabinogion and the Arthurian legends. In the Book of Lost Tales, Tolkien introduced names like Ingwe or Ingwe for the eldest of the elves. These names are similar to figures in Norse mythology, such as Ingvi Freyr, a god associated with the elf world Alfheimr. Tolkien's elves, in their larger and more noble forms, were inspired by his own Catholic beliefs. He envisioned them as beings who were akin to humans, but without the flaws and limitations of mortal life. They were immortal, possessing greater spiritual abilities, sharper senses, and a deep connection to nature. Tolkien described them as being made in the image of man, but without the burdens that humans face. In his early work, Tolkien included a mix of serious and playful elves. Some were grand and noble, like Fëanor and Turgon, while others were more whimsical and lighthearted, like the Solosimpi and Tinuviel. The diversity and his portrayal of elves showed his ability to blend different aspects of elf mythology into his stories. Tolkien also experimented with ideas like children visiting Valinor, the elves' homeland, in their dreams, and elves visiting children at night to comfort them. However, he eventually moved away from these ideas in his later writings. As Tolkien continued to develop his stories, he refined his vision of elves into the iconic beings we know today. His elves became essential characters in his Middle-earth tales, representing a blend of beauty, wisdom, and otherworldly charm. This evolution in Tolkien's portrayal of elves shows how his early influences and personal beliefs helped shape his imaginative world. In The Hobbit, written between 1930 and 1937, Tolkien brought to life two distinct kinds of elves, serious and whimsical. Douglas Anderson points out that Tolkien included both noble, serious elves like Elrond and the Wood Elf King, Thranduil, as well as more playful and lighthearted elves, such as the Elvish guards at Rivendell. This blend of types reflects Tolkien's early efforts to balance different aspects of elf lore, combining grandeur with more whimsical elements. In 1937, Tolkien faced criticism from a publisher who dismissed his manuscript for the Silmarillion as being filled with confusing Celtic names. The publisher's comment reflected a broader misunderstanding of Tolkien's intentions. Tolkien defended his use of these names, insisting they were not Celtic in origin. He expressed a strong disapproval of Celtic mythology, describing it as chaotic and lacking coherent design. Tolkien's comment suggested he did not see a direct connection between his own elf lore and Celtic traditions. However, some scholars like Dimitri Fimi argue that Tolkien's dismissal of Celtic influences might be more about his personal preferences than an accurate reflection of his work's roots. In her essay, Mad Elves and Elusive Beauty, Some Celtic Strands of Tolkien's Mythology, Fimi suggests that Tolkien's elven stories might indeed have been influenced by Celtic mythology. For instance, she points out that the tale of the flight of the Nodoli bears similarities to the myth of the Tuatha De Danann, a group of deities from Irish folklore and their migration stories from early Celtic history. John Garth supports this view by noting that Tolkien's depiction of the Nodoli, an elf race enslaved by the Dark Lord Melkor, parallels Irish myths involving the Tuatha De Danann. According to Garth, Tolkien was essentially reworking elements of these Irish myths into a Christian context. This blending of mythologies allowed Tolkien to craft a unique, rich world for his elves while drawing on various traditional stories. Despite his rejection of Celtic influences, it is clear that elements of these ancient myths found their way into his writing, Tolkien's elves. With their beauty, wisdom, and sometimes sorrowful history, reflect complex stories of influences, creating a lasting and memorable part of his literary world. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien crafted a fascinating narrative where he presents himself as a mere translator of Bilbo and Frodo's memoirs, known collectively as the Red Book of Westmarch. He suggests that the English names and terms we read are his translations from the common speech of Middle-earth. A key theme that emerges in The Lord of the Rings is the idea of elves diminishing over time. This theme is particularly highlighted in the dialogue of Galadriel, one of the most powerful elves. She reflects on the inevitable fading of their realm, Lothlórien, saying that if the elves succeed in their mission, their power will decrease and Lothlórien will slowly disappear. The elves must either leave for the west or become a simpler, more rustic people, eventually to be forgotten. In a letter written in 1954, while he was proofreading The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explained that the Elvish language Sindarin had similarities to Welsh, which suited the Celtic-like legends of its speakers. Despite this, he made it clear that his elves were quite different from the traditional European elves and fairies. Instead of magical creatures from folklore, Tolkien's elves are depicted as beings with extraordinary artistic talent, striking beauty, and a longer lifespan. Tolkien also explored the notion of nobility in his world through the elves. In his writings, an elf's bloodline is the only real claim to nobility in Middle-earth. However, he also pointed out that the elves themselves were partly responsible for many of Middle-earth's troubles. They created the Three Rings to preserve their realms from fading and to resist the natural changes that time brings. This attempt to halt the inevitable growth and transformation of their domains had significant consequences. The elves are depicted as powerful and beautiful beings who, despite their efforts to resist change, must ultimately face the fading of their age. Their struggle against time and change adds depth to their characters and highlights the themes of impermanence and the passing of eras in Tolkien's epic world. In Tolkien's rich world, the story of the elves begins during a time called the First Age. The first elves were awakened by Eru Ilúvatar, near a place known as Cuivianen, a bay surrounded by water. At this point, the sun and moon had not yet been created, so the elves awoke under a sky full of stars. The very first elves were three pairs, Imin and his wife, Iminye, Tata and Tati, and Enel and Enelye. As these elves began to explore their surroundings, they found other elves and created communities. They lived near waters and were the first to develop poetry and music in Middle-earth. Over time, they discovered different groups of elves. Some had dark hair and were the ancestors of the Nodor, while others sang without words and were the ancestors of the Teleri. The elves were eventually discovered by Orome, one of the Valar, who informed the other Valar, then Valinor, about these new beings. The Valar, who were powerful beings tasked with shaping the world, decided to invite the elves to Valinor, a land of great beauty. Orome was sent to lead them. He brought three elves, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë, as ambassadors to Valinor. These three elves were tasked with persuading their fellow elves to make the journey to this new land. Many elves accepted the invitation and became known as the Eldar, or People of the Stars, while those who chose to stay behind were called the Avari, or the Unwilling. The elves who agreed to travel were divided into three main groups: the Vanyar, led by Ingve, the Noldor, led by Finwë, and the Teleri, led by Elwë. The Vanyar and the Nodor traveled across the Misty Mountains and the Ired Linden Range, reaching a floating island called Tol Eressëa, which was then moved to Valinor by Ulmo, a powerful water spirit. The Teleri, however, were hesitant to cross the Misty Mountains. Some of them turned back and settled in the Anduin Valley, becoming the Nandor under their leader Linwë. Meanwhile, Elwë, one of the Teleri leaders, went missing, causing many of the Teleri to stay behind in Beleriand, searching for him. Over time, those who eventually reached Valinor were led by Elwë's brother Olwë. These Teleri became known as the Sindar, while those who stayed in Beleriand were later known as the Faladhrim, led by Círdan. Matthew Dickerson, a scholar of Tolkien's work, notes that Tolkien's evolving ideas about the elves and their divisions led to complex changes in their names and histories. Tolkien, a philologist by profession, used these divisions to develop two main languages for the elves: Quenya, spoken by the Eldar, and Sindarin, spoken by the Sindar. According to Dickerson, Tolkien's creation of these languages was a driving force behind the stories he crafted, not the other way around. Tom Shippey, another scholar, emphasizes that the elves' divisions are not just about differences in appearance, like light and dark, but also deeply rooted in their histories and migrations. In the land of Valinor, Fëanor, one of the most powerful elves, created 3 brilliant jewels called the Silmarils. These gems had some of the light from the 2 trees that illuminated Valinor. However, trouble brewed when Melkor, a dark and powerful being, was released from his punishment after being imprisoned for his evil deeds. Though he pretended to be reformed, Melkor, now known as Morgoth, started spreading discord among the elves, turning them against the Valar, who were the guardians of Valinor. Morgoth's actions grew more malicious. He killed Fëanor's father, Finwë, and stole the Silmarils. Furious and heartbroken, Fëanor, who had already renamed Morgoth as the Black Enemy, vowed to recover the Silmarils. He and his 7 sons led the Noldor Elves, a powerful group among the elves, on a dangerous mission to Beleriand, a land far to the west of Valinor, to confront Morgoth and retrieve the stolen jewels. In Beleriand, the elves eventually found Elwë, who had been missing and was now known as Thingol after marrying Melian, a Maya, who was a kind of lesser divine being. Thingol became the ruler of Beleriand. Soon after, the Noldor elves arrived and laid siege to Morgoth's stronghold, Angband. Despite their efforts, they faced many defeats. The elves struggled to gain control, and key kingdoms like Nargothrond, Dorlath, and Gondolin fell to Morgoth's forces. As the conflict dragged on and the elves were pushed further south in Beleriand, hope seemed lost. Then, Eärendil, a brave half-elf from the House of Finwë, made a daring move. He sailed to Valinor to plead with the Valar for aid. The Valar, moved by Eärendil's plea, launched the War of Wrath. This war was a massive effort to finally defeat Morgoth and end his reign of terror. With the help of the Valar, Morgoth was ultimately overthrown, bringing a hard-fought end to his dark rule and the war in Beleriand. This period in Elven history was marked by great battles, heroic deeds, and the struggle to reclaim lost glory, shaping the fate of Middle-earth for ages to come. After the epic War of Wrath, the Valar, who had come to the aid of the elves, invited them back to Valinor, their ancient home. Many elves accepted this invitation and traveled back to Valinor, but some chose to stay in Middle-earth. During the Second Age, these elves established new realms. They created Lindon from the remains of Beleriand, Eregion, and Rhovanion, which included the Forest of Mirkwood. However, their peace was short-lived. Sauron, who had once served Morgoth, waged war against them. With the help of the Númenóreans, a powerful race of men, the elves managed to push back Sauron. Despite their victory, the battles came at a great cost, with Gil-galad, the Elven king, and Elendil, the king of the Númenóreans, losing their lives. To protect themselves and their realms, the elves used the 3 Rings of Power. These magical rings helped safeguard their lands. The most famous of these realms included Lothlórien, governed by Galadriel, and Celeborn, Rivendell, overseen by Elrond and home to the elf lord Glorfindel, and the Grey Havens, managed by Círdan the Shipwright. Círdan and his people built the ships that carry the elves back to Valinor. Rings faded, marking the start of the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. Most elves departed for Valinor, leaving Middle-earth behind. Those who remained faced a slow decline, becoming more isolated and less influential. Over time, these elves gradually faded from the world, becoming what Galadriel described as a rustic folk of dell and cave. In the modern world of Middle-earth, stories and legends about these elusive elves persisted. Eliadan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, chose to stay in Lindon instead of traveling to Valinor. Celeborn and other elves from the Grey Havens also lingered for a time before eventually leaving for Valinor. Legolas, another prominent elf, established a colony in Ithilien during the reign of King Elisar. The elves there contributed to the rebuilding of Gondor and lived primarily in the southern region of Ithilien along the Anduin River. After Elisar's death, Legolas built a ship and sailed to Valinor, followed by the remaining elves of Ithilien. By the time of the tale of the Aragorn and Arwen in Appendix A, most elves have departed Middle-earth. Only a few remained in Mirkwood and Lindon, and the once vibrant garden of Elrond and Rivendell was now empty. Arwen, the last of the great elven princesses, retreated to the deserted Lothlórien, where she eventually passed away. Elven in the Lord of Rings are often seen as beautiful, strong, and wise, appearing almost superior to the race of men. Given their exceptional qualities, it might seem puzzling why some elven women choose to marry mortal men. Is this a case of true love conquering all, or does it carry an underlying tragedy? And why don't elven men typically marry mortal women? Let's start by looking at some famous elf-human pairings. Aragorn and Arwen are among the most well-known. Arwen, an elven princess, decides to become mortal because of her deep love for Aragorn. This decision not only affects her life, but also has significant implications for the future of Middle-earth. By marrying Aragorn, Arwen helps to restore the line of kings of Gondor and Arnor. Her choice symbolizes a merging of elven wisdom and strength with human leadership, which proves beneficial for the royal line. The pairing of elves and humans often serves a purpose beyond love. Take Beren and Luthien, for example. Their story is crucial to the lore of Middle-earth. Beren, a mortal man, and Luthien, an elven woman, undertake a perilous quest to retrieve a Silmaril, a powerful jewel. Luthien's love for Beren so strong that when he dies, she persuades Mandos, the Vala of the Dead, to reunite them. However, Mandos cannot grant this alone. He seeks permission from Manwë, who then asks Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme deity. Luthien is given a choice. She can remain with the Valar forever, or return to Middle-earth as a mortal to be with Beren. She chooses the latter, highlighting how deep her love runs and how significant her choice is for the world. As for why elven men marrying mortal women isn't a common theme, it's not explicitly explained in the text. It could be that the nature of elven life and their extended lifespans make such relationships less common. Elves typically live for thousands of years, which might create a barrier for long-term relationships with mortals. Additionally, elven men might find themselves less inclined to seek out mortal partners due to the different lifespans and the changes that come with them. The rare elf-human marriages in Tolkien's work often blend love with broader narrative significance. These relationships symbolize a mix of elven and human qualities and have lasting impacts on Middle-earth. While the opposite pairing of elven men with mortal women isn't highlighted, the existing stories of love and choice show how these unions serve both personal and epic purposes in Tolkien's world. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, Arwen, a prominent elven character, is directly linked to Luthien, a legendary elf from the past, and both are renowned for their extraordinary beauty and their deep love for mortal men. Arwen's story mirrors Luthien's in many ways. Luthien's granddaughter Elwing is the great-grandmother of Elrond and Elros. When given a choice between remaining with the elves or living as a mortal, Elrond opts for immortality among the elves, while Elros chooses to live a mortal life and becomes the first king of Numenor. This decision impacts Arwen and Aragorn's union as their marriage brings together the two branches of Luthien's family line, echoing the earlier tale of Beren and Luthien. However, a curious question arises. Why do we mostly see elven women marrying mortal men, rather than the other way around? Why aren't there more stories of elven men choosing mortal women as their partners? Several reasons might explain this pattern. First, elven men might have had different views on romance compared to elven women. Elven men could have been more selective about their partners, preferring to marry other elves due to their shared eternal nature and qualities. In contrast, elven women like Luthien and Arwen might have been more willing to take the risk of loving mortals. Their stories often emphasize their bravery and willingness to defy traditional boundaries for the sake of true love. Another factor is the nature of fantasy storytelling. In many fantasy stories, including those by Tolkien, we see the theme of an ordinary individual revealed to be of noble heritage, marrying someone of high status. This scenario is quite common. On the other hand, stories where a noble person marries someone from a humble background are less frequent. Tolkien's tales often focus on these romantic scenarios, which might explain why we don't see as many examples of elven men marrying mortal women. Tolkien himself might have preferred the dramatic and poignant love stories of elven women with mortals, reflecting his own views and experiences. Additionally, the rarity of elf-human pairings in Middle-earth could simply be a matter of chance. There might not be extensive records of elven men marrying mortal women. An example from Tolkien's writings is Aginor, an elven man who loved a mortal woman named Andreth. Unfortunately, their relationship never came to fruition due to the turmoil of war. Agnor's death leaves Andreth heartbroken, highlighting the challenges of such unions. The differing fates of elves and humans also play a role. Elves are immortal while humans are not, and this difference creates a significant barrier in relationships between the two races. Unless there is divine intervention, such as from Eru Iluvatar, the separation caused by death would be a profound tragedy. Tolkien stories often highlight the happier outcomes of elf-human unions, making them more memorable. Hey, if these fictional characters were real, would you like to meet them? And let me know which character's your favorite. I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below, and for more such amazing videos, please do subscribe to our channel. Subscribe to our channel. Subscribe to our channel.